Today we're doing a step-by-step workshop on how to paint a seascape. When I paint in this style using gouache, ideally I'd like to be outside in the location. There's something immediate about painting on location. I choose to use gouache paint for this and for this demonstration because one can work relatively quickly. We want to be able to capture enough information about the scene without overcomplicating things. Today we're painting from a photograph. This photo captures the drama of the Norfolk coast. The difference between painting outside and painting from a photograph is that a photograph captures a moment in time and it freezes it for you. If you're painting on location, you look down and then you look up again, and not only the clouds changed but also the tone of the sea or how the light is casting upon the sand. So as we paint today, we're going to be painting this photograph as though we were painting outside. I hope you all have fun. I'm going to put up some information now about the materials you need. I've simplified it so everybody can join in. It is 3 simple colours: red, blue and yellow plus white. I'm using a medium brush and I am painting on watercolour paper. With this painting we will be using a limited palette of yellow, red and blue. These are our primary colours, and out of these primary colours we can make our secondary colours, which are orange, green and violet. Using a limited palette really helps us to understand more about colour and to get the most out of the least. We're using gouache paint today. You can also use acrylic. If you don't have either of those, you can use watercolour, but you're going to need some white because white is going to be very important in this painting. I use gouache paint because you can do many different techniques with it, and you can bridge the gap between some of the other mediums. Gouache is very similar to watercolour, however it can also be used like acrylic. So when painting a landscape or seascape, I tend to start the painting by creating a block of colour which is just above the horizon line. The reason I do this is it gives me a basic composition for where I'm going to begin. So when we look at our photograph, we see that the lightest area above the horizon is a kind of a light grey violet colour. To mix that colour, I'm going to take some blue, and to create a violet I'm going to add a small amount of red to that blue. You see immediately it's shifted to purple. I want that slightly bluer. My paint is relatively thin. This colour is now dark, and the best way to tone any colour down is through the addition of white. Now I've got this nice light violet colour. What I want to do is just mark where my horizon is going to be, and I'm going to do that by adding these light circular strokes of my brush across the horizon line. And as we move up towards the top of the sky, we will start to get increasingly more blue into our mix. So I'm going to take some blue, and whilst my paint is still relatively wet, take that blue, add a little bit more white, and I just want to work over that line some bluer colour. Now as we move towards the top of the picture, I'm going to add some more blue to that mix to make it slightly more intense. And here we go. Again, same kind of motions, just scrubbing that paint along. And as you can see, it's relatively fluid, but not as fluid as watercolour would be. I'm adding some more blue to that mix now for the final little layer at the top. Here we go, and I'm just scrubbing that in. Now what we've got there is the basic backdrop for our sky. When I paint like this, I tend to work in layers, and to give you an example, this sky that we've put in is the backdrop. The clouds that we will add later are the characters that are set upon that backdrop. But for the time being, we don't have to worry about those clouds. My next step is going to be just looking at trying to straighten that horizon line slightly and lighten it just a bit. So I'm going to pick up some white paint into that violet colour that I created earlier. At the moment this is just so I can straighten and smoothen out that horizon line. In much tighter circular motions, just come across and then across again, just blend that fluid white paint into the horizon. So we've got a much straighter line coming across there now. Moving on to the next stage, and it's important I explain what we're doing. We're working on the painting as a whole, but we're just blocking out certain areas that are important to the image itself. I've put the backdrop of the sky in. The next thing I want to look at is creating a horizon line across here where the sea is meeting the sky. If I look at the sea in the photograph, it's a kind of green, blue, grey colour. What we want to first do is mix a bluish green. I'm going to take some of my ultramarine blue here, and I'm going to add some yellow to that blue. Already it's become like a much more aqua-like colour. Because of a limited palette we're using, we'll never be able to get the exact colours in nature or in the photograph, but we can get close to them. Now whilst my paint is slightly fluid, more like watercolour, what I'm going to do, I'm going to gauge where I want my horizon line, but also where the sea is starting. In our image you can see that there's this piece of headland which is coming down, and it kind of meets the horizon line of the sea. Now with my brush, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to start with the tip of the brush and drag my brush over, slowly pressing it down a little bit harder as I go along. And here I go again, just pressing that down slightly harder. Yeah. Now at the moment that's just the basis of our sea. I am going to add a small amount of tonal difference to it. I've added white to the colour I already created, but it doesn't capture the warmth, the warm kind of colour that's happening in that sea. So I'm going to take the smallest amount of yellow and put it into that mix. Now that has created a very pale green. I'm going to take a small amount of white and add it into there. And whilst my first horizon line is still there, I'm going to follow the shape, and I'm just going to drag my brush, starting with a tip, and just drag it right across there, back and forth a little bit. So I'm slowly blending into the line I don't put down. It's funny sometimes when you think about the colour of a sea. A lot of people would start with pure blue, but the sea is very rarely blue. In Norfolk, the sea is often this green colour, from bottle green to almost pea soup green. Now we've put this basic line of the sea in, what I will do is I'll move on to the next part. At this stage we're still blocking in our colours, and the next major body of colour that I can see there is the sand. When I look at the sand, it is clearly a yellowy orange colour. If I was painting with a full palette of colours, I would most probably have an earth colour like yellow ochre or raw sienna that could quickly make that kind of colour. But because I'm limited to my 3 primary colours here, I've got to try and create that colour myself. So when I look at it, it looks closer to orange and yellow. Now I'll add in the smallest amount of red. It becomes a vivid orange. Now that orange there is way too bright for what I need. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use my white to really tone this orange down. I want it slightly redder, so again just a touch of red paint. Now for me that is still too vivid and doesn't really match the natural colours. We're going to explore something here called complementary colours, where you can tone down some of your brighter colours by using a small amount of their complementary. So here I have this orange. If I'm to put my blue next to the orange, the blue and the orange interact in a way that the blue becomes bluer and the orange becomes more vivid orange. Orange here is toned down quite a bit, so we don't get the same effect. But the relationship between blue and orange is a complementary relationship. The same can be said for red and green and yellow and violet. When working with a limited palette, you have to rely on a lot of these relationships to help tone some of your colours down to make them more natural. If the complementary of orange is blue, we put them together, they stand out. But something interesting happens when you add a small amount of blue into the orange and mix it up. The complementary colours, rather than complementing each other in a mix, actually begin to cancel each other out. Now here you can see it taking on a slightly greeny grey tone. That to me says there's a little bit too much yellow in there, so I'm going to add some more red to my orangey mix. And again I'm going to add a little bit of blue. Now what I'm starting to create is a much more natural colour, because the blue has toned down the intensity. Now I've got a base kind of colour for my sand. We will be adding some different tones to it later. I'm just going to go in and block in the area of the sand. And again with these circular motions which we used up in the sky, I'm just going to work the colour into the surface. The reason I'm using these circular motions rather than back and forth strokes is that it helps create a greater sense of surface texture and a diversity in the types of brush strokes. So little bits of light from the undercolour and the paper starts to shine through. It's an irregular brush stroke that really is beneficial to creating a more natural looking painting. Now I've created the sand like colour, I just want to lighten it a bit. So to lighten, in a few areas, like up here, and some areas for sand over here, with the same kind of motions, come over that darker colour. What it's creating there is a bit of tonal variety in the sand, something we can come back to later. Now my next major block of colour in the painting is this bit of headland that is kind of coming off like a triangle and jutting into the sea. To create a dark colour like this, what we want to do is again to work with our primaries, but this time I'm not going to include white in the mix. I'm taking some blue here because if I look at the headland, it is more green than it is red. So I want to make a basic green by adding some yellow to some blue there. To me that is much too light, so I'm going to pick up some more blue, and again I'm going to add some yellow into it. We're getting closer now, it's a little bit too blue. We're going to come back to the idea of complementary colours that we used earlier. So I've got a green here. Green is the complementary of red. If it was a brighter green, you would see the red and the green really bouncing off each other here, their colours. But like with the blue into orange, when you add a small amount of the complementary colour into the green, so you add a bit of red into the green, it starts to take it into a completely different direction. It starts to cancel out the brightness of the green and of the red too. So a little bit more. And we're starting to get into a territory which is closer to black than anything else. I just want to feel out the shape of the headland coming in. So rather than drawing an outline in pencil or even the paintbrush, very delicate circular strokes, just find the shape like so. I want my bottom line to be a little bit straighter, so I'm going to just create a line across there that meets the horizon of the sea. I'll go back to making these circular strokes across here and slowly create the shape through my brush. Again, we can come back to it later, but for time being we can start to move to the next stage of our painting. Just change my water in preparation to move on to the next stage of the painting. So the next stage of the painting is going to be creating what would be the second layer, add a little bit more detail. As I said before, the sky that we painted was merely the backdrop for the characters of the clouds that will come on top. Bearing in mind that we are painting from a photograph, and I want to avoid as best I can any photorealism. I want to create an impression of the scene and not a perfect replica. So what I will do next is I want to look at the shadow elements of the clouds. By putting the shadows in first, what we can see is really where our clouds can go, the shape of our clouds can fit on top. So to make this shadow colour, I'm going to first make a violet, and I'm making a violet out of blue and a touch of red. That's a lovely purpley violet colour. Now, we talked earlier about the complementaries with red and green and blue and orange. Here's where we're going to rely on another complementary. So yellow and violet are complementary colours. You often see these in flowers. It's very beautiful. Also, painters have used this to their advantage, Van Gogh in particular. So we've got a violet blue mix here. If I take a small amount of this yellow, we want to work in very small amounts when adding colours, just so we don't have to overwhelm and start again. So I'm adding into that violet colour a small amount of yellow, and what is happening to that violet, it's becoming close to a dark bluish grey, and that is what we're looking for to create the shadows of our clouds. What I'm now going to do is add just a tiny bit of white to that, because I still want it to be dark. And on my painting, I'm just going to lightly feel out where my clouds are going to be. With my brush, I'm not really committing, so I'm just slowly just feeling out the shapes. And up in the top here, there's quite a bit of cloud, so I'm just going to put in a little bit more of that dark colour over here too. Again, don't worry about getting the shapes perfect. All you're doing is just putting a little bit of shadow in there upon which we will build afterwards. So this would be the darkest area of our clouds. You can see that there's a small amount down here, a little bit more there, and we've loosely put those shapes in. Whilst the paint is still a little wet, I'm going to grab quite a bit more white, and it's slightly thicker this time, and create a lighter grey. Over the shapes of the clouds, I'm just going to, with the same probing type brush marks, an element of where your shadows are and where a slightly lighter area is above. Our next step is to pick up some more white, much lighter. We don't want to add pure white to begin with, because that will be our highlights just at the end. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into those shapes I've created, just add some of that brighter white on top of the layer that I've just put down. I'm not blending at the moment, I'm just adding some white and dragging it around. Again, it's a similar type of brush marks that I'm using. Light and non-committal. Now over here I can see that it's much brighter. I'm going to put some more grey white over here than anywhere else. Up here too. Down here. And some down here as well. There we go, just dragging the brush in. It's always good just to have a look, step back and see where you'd like to add some lighter areas. If we look at the amount of blue that's actually in the photograph, there's not that much blue. There's almost more white, so we want the blue poking through a little bit. For the time being, I'm just going to leave the clouds, and I'm going to come down to my horizon line here. on my painting the horizon line looks a little bit too light for me, so I'm going to use some of this grey and I want to add just a small amount of blue to it. And I'm going to come in where I've done my sea horizon line. I just want to do a line across it to mirror the horizon line. And just to darken that area a little bit, still leaving little bits of light poking through. What I want to do next is I want to add another shape that we've yet to add into it, and this is the shoreline here. It's probably the lightest area of the painting apart from some elements of the clouds, and we really want to get it in there because it helps us gauge other aspects of what we see in the painting. I'm going to go slightly carefully here because you don't want to add too much white as it's quite difficult to get rid of. So I'm going to look at how this shoreline comes around and follow the sea that I've already put in there, and just with my brush, just to gently start there, I'm going to now drag it across here. Now I've created that extra shape that's coming across there. I'm just going to pick up a little bit more white just to make it slightly more intense. And again, from that place over here, just start with the tip of the brush and drag it right over, like so. You can see the colours from underneath, the layers from underneath are really showing through that surf, and this creates an effect of it being like water. Just beneath the surf here we see this area of grey that is actually a reflection of the sky, but because the water's shallow and it's sand, it's looking much darker than anything in the sky. It's almost a different colour. If we want to recreate that, ultramarine blue, or any blue you have, with some red in it to create a violet colour, and into that violet we add some yellow, which creates this really interesting grey colour. I'm going to add a small amount of white to that and just a tad more blue. The reflection that's in the photograph actually comes right down to the corner of the painting there. I'm just going to dab my brush in water and pick up some of that colour, and I just want to again follow my shoreline around. That looks a little bit too dark, so how we would adjust that is by adding some white to our mix. And then just modifying that colour by layering over some white, and I'm going to start to use those circular motions again over the darker colour. I'm now looking at my sand, and my sand and the reflection seem oddly separate from each other. I want to be able to create my sand colour again and make it blend in a little bit to some of the elements that we've added. So how we made the sand colour is that we created an orange, and that was out of yellow and red. There we go. So that's a really rich deep orange. Now to tone that orange down, we used Orange is complementary, which is blue. Take some of that blue and add it in to my orange. I'm going to add a bit of white into that mix. There we go. That's the kind of colour I'm looking for. So again, I'm just dragging my brush over the layers that we put in before and bringing it up over the shadow slightly. Now I really want to lighten that colour quite a lot, so I'm putting a lot of white into it. By adding darker colours over lighter colours and vice versa, it's also known as scumbling with a dry brush. You get a real sense of texture in the landscape. Often when we go to galleries and we see paintings, they seem so complex on the surface, multi-layered, and this is often how it's done. It's a process of slowly building up a surface through darker and lighter tones. See, I'm just dragging my brush very lightly over the surface. I'm going to mix some of this white back into the darker colour, and just down here just add a few little brush marks over here as well. So we've got something that looks similar to sand. A painting like this would normally take me about 10 to 20 minutes. If I was painting in a landscape, I tend to work quite fast, creating an impression of a scene, not an exact replica. I'm going to go back up into the sky now and add a little bit more shape and definition to my clouds, and I'll do this through dark and light. I want to put some pure white down because this is going to be the highlights of the clouds. And I'm just looking at my image just to see where some really light areas are. I can see there's one there. Again, it's just simple little brush strokes over the top of what we've already done. We have quite a lovely area of light over here as well. Down closer to our horizon line. What you see with clouds is the closer to the horizon line, the smaller and closer together they are, the closer to us, the larger and more spread out they are. What I want to do now is just take a wet brush. It's slightly wet, and I want to just blend some of these areas of the clouds together. But just where some of the darker grey is meeting the lighter grey, just want to create some slight blends where the lighter grey is interacting with the white. If you're using acrylic, you can do this with just a little bit of white paint to help join the two together. I'm looking now up in this corner here, and I'd like to make that shadow slightly larger. I'm just creating a bit of a violety colour here, and I'm just going to cover some of that blue sky up with a shadow colour and drag it over here. I'm going to add some white to that. It's a little bit too dark in areas. And I'm just going to blend a bit of white into that dark colour. Try and get a bit of a transition going on. You can see also that this shadow here needs a little bit more depth to it. And over here too. And over here. I'm going to pick up a a little bit more white. And blend some in. Really the sky is made up of a variety of different brush marks and different tones. You don't have to be perfect about it. If you have a little bit of confidence with the brush, using those different tones, it will do half the work for you. And you can always go in and adjust little parts and put some highlights here and there. And a little bit of blending here and there. One could spend ages up in the sky making it perfect, but for now I'm just going to leave it like that. I've done a few versions of this painting for demonstrations and each one has turned out differently. Now what I want to do is to start looking at wrapping this seascape up. I want to be coming back here to where my shoreline is. I want to add just a little bit more in. So I'm going to take some pure white. I'm just going to have some on the end of my brush. And following the shape again, remember I was using a point here, I'm just going to drag that across like so. And just with some pure white paint, just start adding a few irregular little shapes into those waves. Waves are extremely difficult to paint. If you take them literally, what you see, you get stuck there. But if you create an impression of the waves, quite effective what you can do with just a few layers of colour. Now the next thing I want to do, I'm looking over my headland and it's looking a little bit dull. So I've picked up some blue and now picking up some yellow to make a green. To add to that green, it's complementary, which is a bit of red. Some more blue. Just going to go over to that headland and I'm just going to create a few diagonal brush strokes along it. Now, as we get towards an end with this, no painting is ever truly finished, of course, but there's just a couple of things I want to change. I want to make my horizon line slightly bolder, so I'm going to take some blue and in it I'm going to add a small amount of green to make a kind of a sea green, a little bit more blue. Very carefully just leaning over it, I just want to drag that across. Now it looks too dark by laying it down, but there's a way we can modify that. Just rinse my brush off and I'm going to follow the shape, but I'm going to cut into it. So this is a wet brush that I've just rinsed off and I've just followed the line I've created, cut back into the dark line and diluting it a little bit. I'm going to now take some white and add it to that colour, and you can see it's really quite blue, so I'm going to add a little bit of yellow to it, and just on where the sea is, just add a little bit of variety to it. So I need some more white and some more yellow. There we go. I'm just using, again, these delicate kind of brush marks over the sea. And I want to grab a bit more white just to marry up where my waves were again with the sea. Sometimes to create a finished painting you need to unify elements of it. One element that isn't unified for me, and it's partly because I just put it in, is the horizon line and the sky above it. What I'm going to do, I've got some grey on my palette left over here. I only want a small amount of paint on the brush. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to find where my horizon line is and pick up some of that dark colour that I've put in for the sea and just blend it a little bit into the sky. I can see also the areas of the painting still need a few dark and light highlights. I just want to get a little bit of green here. Just add small amounts of green to this area coming down here. And I see also on my beach I've kind of lost the shadow area a little bit. So I'm just going to make a violet very quickly. And again I'm going to add my complementary to my violet. Needs a bit more blue in there to make this grey colour. A little bit of white. Re-establish a bit that shadow that's been lost. I'm just going to go over that. As soon as you put something down, you see something that needs a little bit of attention somewhere else. Now for me that has made me look again at both my sand and the surf. I realised in the surf that there are some elements of greeny brown in there. And do some little touches in the sea. And now with the white, I'm seeing also that the white really needs to come much more into the sea. And to make this appear closer to us, which it is, I'm just going to add a few more heavy brush marks into it. Whilst I've got the white, I want to add up there a little bit more. Soften some of those clouds as I do it. Also looking at my sand, I'm going to create a quick orange. Very light, so I've just put a red into white to make a pink. Now I'll add some yellow to that to make an orange. And I'm just going to be a little bit bold here and add a few brush marks across. One across there too. Still not happy with my sea, so I just want to smooth it out. And you see now I'm just mixing the colours that I already have on my palette to create mixes that are in harmony with what we've already created. A lot of the knowledge about colour and mixing just comes with time, and this is one of the reasons why using a limited palette to start painting, if you're just a beginner or even if you're a bit practiced, is such a good thing to do, because it teaches you how to get the most out of the least. Just a couple of touches I want to put here, and a bit of darker colour in there. I'm going to grab a little bit of white into that colour, a little bit more yellow, and just add some to the sand, get a little bit more light going on in there. removed the masking tape. The reason I use masking tape is when you remove it, it creates an illusion of a frame. It automatically tidies up your edges, and you can find this very helpful, especially if you think your painting's a mess. But anyway, this is the finished piece from the workshop. There's always improvements to be made in it, but I'm quite satisfied with how it turned out. It would turn out different each time I painted it. If I was to repeat this process, it would turn out different, because so much about it is how the paint works and how the brush marks work. You've kind of got to let the paint do its own thing. It's all about how you control the brush. Don't go in too heavy. Don't commit. Just feel it out. Get to know your colours and do an impression of a scene. Don't get caught up in the detail of a photograph. Photography is great at capturing reality, and paintings are great at capturing a version of reality, how you see it. Paint is its own language. So I hope you enjoyed that, and if you've got any questions, do feel free to ask. Bye.